Hey class, welcome back to Intro Psych. We are using the King textbook and moving into chapter 12, which means, we only have 3 chapters left, and you can kind of look at these next 3 chapters as, pretty much interlinked to one another. Chapter 12, we're going to look at psychological disorders. So looking at sort of prevalence, etymology, things like that, different kinds of disorders. And then chapter 13, we'll be looking at how those disorders are treated. Chapter 14 will kind of explore the topic of how physical health and psychological health interact by looking at the topic of stress. So this chapter 12, we'll be looking at psychological disorders. We're going to be looking at sort of defining what is considered a psychological disorder, what constitutes as abnormal behavior, and then we'll start actually diving into some specific classifications of disorder, neurodevelopmental, anxiety, trauma, disorders related to emotion and mood, eating disorders, schizophrenia, personality, and then we'll also look at a topic related to mental health, which is the subject of suicide. And also how we can, as individuals who know more about these things, how can we combat the stigma associated with mental health, because it still exists. It's definitely getting better. For example, it's more common for people to talk about their mental health than it probably ever has been, but there's still room for growth there. So, sometimes you'll see this chapter, taught as abnormal psychology or psychopathology or mental illness. So we're really talking about a lot of the same things here, but, we're talking about mental health. Specifically, we're talking about when mental health kind of transitions from, normal to abnormal, when behavior becomes normal from abnormal. And what we're talking about with abnormal, we're looking at it from a few different perspectives. One, it needs to deviate. It needs to be atypical. It deviates what's from considered the norm. It also needs to be dysfunctional, maladaptive, meaning it impairs basic life functioning. Think like depression. Like, it's one thing to be sad, like everybody gets sad, but it's something else entirely to be so sad that you don't get up and bathe yourself and feed yourself and go to work and go to class and do all the things that you need to do to take care of yourself. That's what I mean by dysfunctional. And then lastly, it causes distress or despair. It's not something that is pleasant. It's usually associated with a lot of unpleasant emotions: sadness, anxiety, tension, fear, worry, despair. All of those things are associated with many of the disorders that we're going to talk about. And so we're also talking about, these things are not happening acutely, they're happening chronically, they're happening over a long period of time. Again, it's one thing to be sad or even depressed for a day, but if this is happening chronically, if it's happening weeks, or it's even happening months or years, that's definitely when we're starting to get into abnormal behavior. So duration is also another D we might throw in there. It's also important that we, when we talk about things like deviance, we're starting to then get into cultural norms. What is considered deviant from the norm will vary by culture. Will definitely vary by culture. I think about, different cultures, how they express sadness, maybe, in maybe a more kind of white middle class, kind of upbringing, individuals might express, sadness in a more somber way. They're quiet about it. But then if you go into other cultures, maybe other ethnicities, other groups, they will express their sadness in a very different way, much more demonstratively, much more outspoken. And so, if you were looking at that culture from one lens and your specific lens and vice versa, you might think, oh, that's not normal. But again, so, we want to be careful about that when we think about, labeling something as abnormal. Context matters, the culture matters. What we consider normal changes. Like, for example, like a lot of what we're going to be talking about with understanding mental illness comes from the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual for mental illness, created by the APA to make these diagnoses. Well, we're on the 5th edition. The 3rd edition, 20, 30 years old, 20, 30 years ago, classified homosexuality as mental illness. Nowadays, people who are homosexual, gay, lesbian, whatever, they can get married. It's become much more acceptable. It's become normalized. It's no longer considered a mental illness. So that's what I mean by changes happen. I mean, sometimes they take a long time for them to happen, but over the course of my lifetime, just that specific example has changed, quite a bit. Norms. So again, I mean, depending on the time, depending on the place, those norms, those cultural norms and expectations can be limited, oppressive, and even prejudicial. So we want to be really careful how we think about kind of where culture fits in. So it does definitely it's involved in the experience of psychological disorders. Whether we think about it explicitly or not, it's sort of interwoven. So there are several different approaches to thinking about mental illness and diagnosing mental illness. One is a biological medical model, which is basically looking at mental illness as having biological origins. Like we can treat mental illness the same way we can treat physical illness. There's a psychological approach, which instead of looking at the biological aspects, like it says, we're looking at the psychology. We're looking at how various life experiences, the thoughts, the emotions, our personality structure, how those things influence the experience of mental illness. There's also a sociocultural approach, which takes into account things like gender, ethnicity, your socioeconomic status, relationships, all of those things that I'm sort of, kind of getting into in the previous slide, and thinks about that. Context really matters when we're talking about mental illness. But the more kind of holistic approach is the biopsychosocial model, which is essentially using all three of these approaches to try to look at mental illness from only one side of these three dimensions. I mean, you're kind of selling yourself short in terms of being able to really understand pathology and abnormal behavior and its impact and how it can be treated. So modern psychology really tries to look at phenomena, especially with mental illness, through a biopsychosocial lens. And also kind of considering this idea of a vulnerability stress hypothesis that some people might have, for example, genetically speaking, have a greater propensity to mental illness, but it really is our exposures to stress. Like it's when we are in stressful environments that may or might evoke those that genetic expression. So you might have an inheritance of certain genetic traits from your parents, but depending on your environment, will go a long way in terms of whether or not they're expressed. So as I mentioned, the DSM-5 is the current, in the United States, it's our current, text for using to diagnose mental illness. And it's undergone, revisions. Yeah, I'm sure in the next 5-10 years, we'll probably have another edition out, maybe the 6th, who knows. The idea is what allows the medical community, the mental health community to do, to have a common basis for communication. Like, so when one doctor in this state or at a particular doctor's office is talking about depression and he's talking about with another doctor in a whole other state, they're on the same page. They have a common language, so they can talk about the same symptoms or the same prevalence, all those things. It also allows for predictions to be made in terms of treatment plans. And simply providing a name to disorder, whether I think this is probably true, whether or not it's physical or psychological, gives comfort. You put a name to it, you put a face to it, and it's more realistic to deal with when you have a name to it. Some of the disadvantages, again, once you apply a label, especially a mental illness, there are certain stigmas associated with those labels. For example, some people might still feel a certain amount of shame and guilt about being diagnosed or labeled with a mental illness and fear of what that might do to their reputation, real or perceived or not. The DSM mostly operates from a biological, medical kind of perspective. So while like psychiatrists and other medical personnel are able to take into more context, individually, the text itself is kind of looking more so at the biological aspects. And again, when thinking about diagnostic purposes, it's really mostly focusing on the weaknesses, what are, the symptoms that are promoting the disorder, and not so much the strengths the individual might be carrying. And also takes into account a lot of, potentially has been criticized for using, relying too much on social norms, subjective judgments to make these kind of calls. And that's the thing with mental illness. It's not always easy to point to, like, with like cancer, you can point to malignant cells, you can, point to all kinds of things and, that are very tangible and easy to, detect and see. Whereas mental illness, it's not always so easy and kind of, the judgment calls become more subjective, perhaps. There's also a concern that there is a a overdiagnosis, especially because the DSMs have mostly expanded in terms of their diagnostics. It's become more broader. They cast a wider net, more or less, with each edition. So at some point, it becomes a concern. Is like, well, does everybody have mental illness then at that point? And then if that's the case, then you start to wonder about that term. What does that term really mean then? Okay, so some important terms and also to think about when we're talking about this chapter, comorbidity. It's very rare that an individual is dealing with like a single disorder. Oftentimes we're talking about the presence of two or more, like anxiety and depression oftentimes go hand in hand. Substance use goes hand in hand with depression, with anxiety. So it's pretty common to hear that term comorbidity. Etiology is referring to the cause of the disorders. Where do we suspect? Are they biological, psychological, some combination of the above? Risk factors, certain characteristics, might make a person more or less vulnerable to developing a psychological disorder. Psychotherapy, which we're going to spend more time in chapter 13 talking about, is a non-medical process. So it's not the biomedical approach, but looking at how can we treat mental illness, by addressing things like thoughts and emotions and things like that. So the first classification of disorders we're going to look at are neurodevelopmental disorders. And these are ones that are typically, we're talking about biologically based, and they appear in childhood. This is when we start to see the symptoms develop. One of the most common ones that we hear a lot about in the media and otherwise, and all over the place, is autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. Some of the symptoms include deficits in communication, social interaction, repetitive behaviors, really fixated on certain interests and activities. These things are, pretty apparent as early as infancy, and are typically, we're talking about, a lifelong. These are lifelong, where individuals might have an intense preoccupation with a particular object or set of activities. The diagnoses is much more common in boys, and roughly about 1 in every 69 could be diagnosed. And it's no longer simply referred, used to be, autism and Asperger's. It's no longer considered that. It's autism spectrum disorder. And there's, again, a spectrum. So some individuals will display more symptoms, some will display less. The intensity of the symptoms will vary. So it's not, one disorder or another. It's really just how that same disorder looks on a spectrum. So there's a lot of variability in terms of impairment. You can have some individuals diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder who can function more or less, as normal as anyone else can. They can go to school, they can get a job, maybe they just, maybe they're socially awkward, but they're able to maintain a high level of functioning. And then you have other examples where individuals are not able to speak for themselves, take care of themselves, and are in need of constant care. So again, that's why we say it's a spectrum. It's not just like black and white or this or that. It's a lot of variability. So, they're now looking at this more positively. And again, this is where that kind of weaknesses and strengths come in about the DSM-5. But now individuals who are advocating for the behalf of those with autism spectrum disorder, including those diagnosed, is that this is not something to be viewed as a disability, but as a valuable form of neurodiversity that we should be, looking at the strengths rather than the weakness. And I think there's a really good case to be made for that. So what is the etiology? Again, perhaps there could be, I think we've addressed this topic of theory of mind, the inability to kind of take other people's perspectives. That could be what's happening here. Also could be lower social motivation or attention, focus on sensory, fine details rather than kind of the big picture. So these are just some of the symptoms as well. And perhaps you might see these individuals being highly sensitive to sound, to touch, to stimuli. It might be, therefore makes it more difficult to organize sensory experiences. Most of the evidence in terms of where this is coming from is pointing to a genetic and neurological basis. There is no sort of evidence that says, getting a vaccine will, lead to autism. And then for as far as treatment is concerned, we're talking about the use of applied behavioral analysis and sometimes, medications. Another neurodevelopmental disorder that gets a lot of attention is ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's no longer ADD and ADHD. It's still the same. It's all under one umbrella. And the common symptoms we're talking about are inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity, or some combination. There's a lot of debate about whether or not this is an overdiagnosed disorder. About 9% of children are diagnosed. However, if we look around the world, it's more like 5% of the rest of the world. So there's, kind of an ongoing debate. It is typically looked at as a childhood disorder, but the more we understand it, individuals, either whether they're diagnosed in childhood or not, continue to experience symptoms in their life, about 70%. So, article searches and research on, adolescent and adult ADHD have grown rapidly as we understand this disorder more. And as far as outcomes are concerned, it is correlating, associated with lower academic performance, poor peer relations. Those are, again, when you see these kind of neurodevelopmental disorders, those are, a little more common, you would think, that kind of reaction. And the etiology we see associated with premature birth, exposure to teratogens, smoking, alcohol consumption during birth, exposure to leads, pesticides, so environmental contaminants, adverse events, exposure to trauma, exposure to poor environments, also strong genetic component to it, polygenic, meaning it's not coming from a single gene, it's probably a large collection of genes. Also may be a sign of delayed brain maturation, physically maturing, and also is likely an expression of problems in executive functioning, being able to organize cognitively. How it is treated. Typically, we're talking about stimulant-based medications that are intended to regulate dopamine production. There are also non-medical interventions, exercise, meditation, driver safety training, all kinds of things that, besides medication. It's not one of those things that you can only give your kids medication and that's it. There's also psychotherapy. Now we're moving into anxiety-related disorders. It's one thing to worry, like, for example, if you're nervous about your next test or you're worried about an upcoming doctor's appointment, whatever. Those things are normal, but anxiety disorders are when it becomes disabling, when it becomes disruptive, dysfunctional, when it becomes, when you're dealing with such hyperactivity, tension, apprehension that it's, making your day-to-day life just miserable. And it's chronic, it's happening often. So we have disorders like generalized anxiety disorder, where the anxiety is generalized to pretty much anything and everything. You might be worried, oh, did I turn my stove off? Did I lock the door? Do I have enough gas in my car? What happens if I fail this test? Everything seems to lead to potentially some sort of anxiety invoking experience. Panic disorder. This is, when an individual is having reoccurring panic attacks. Maybe, and these can be, especially when you're in places that are unfamiliar, places that are uncomfortable, might evoke, that kind of panic response, going into that really intense fight or flight response where the individual, feels like they can't breathe, their heart's racing, and they just want to get away. And there's also specific phobias, which is having intense anxiety about a specific stimuli. So maybe it's spiders, maybe it's height, maybe it's dogs, maybe it's public speaking, whatever. But it's to the point where it's causing so much distress, it becomes dysfunctional. And then social anxiety disorder is, like it sounds like, your anxiety is sparked by social situations. Maybe that's public speaking, or maybe that's simply just going out in public with your friends and being in a large crowd of people, just kind of makes you more nervous. So these are kind of all fit under the same umbrella of anxiety related disorders. In previous editions, obsessive compulsive disorder was part of this umbrella, but now it's kind of, it's out from underneath the umbrella. Even though this is a disorder that does associate with a lot of anxiety, it is now sort of, consider its own classification of disorders. So let's look at the first one, generalized anxiety, persistent anxiety for at least 6 months. And again, it's kind of anything and everything. It's not one specific thing. The etiology of it, definitely biological. It's related to genetics. It's also related to neurotransmitters like GABA, perhaps even related to breathing abnormalities. Psychological, other factors may be at play. being kind of judging yourself harshly, setting really high standards, whether it's yourself or whether it's from parents, experiencing trauma, having lots of stress in your life, those things can factor in as well. Panic disorder, again, recurrent panic attacks, these really short bursts, sudden bursts of this feeling of terror. Sometimes there's no warning, sometimes there's not even a specific cause. Some people will have triggers, but other people it may just kind of happen randomly, tied to biological factors, genetics, so you might have inherited from your biological parents. It's associated with neurotransmitters, norepinephrine, GABA, serotonin, lactate levels, hormone regulation, also, our conditioning to carbon monoxide, how we breathe in carbon dioxide, not monoxide, carbon dioxide. And there's also gender differences. We do typically see more, it's more commonly diagnosed in females than males. So that, that's something to take into consideration, but it's not saying gender causes it. It may have more to do with sociocultural factors than anything. Phobias, these are an irrational, overwhelming, persistent fear of a particular object. And so, what I mean by irrational is, an individual who has a fear of spiders, human beings are way bigger than spiders, and you can easily walk over and either avoid the spider, or if you wanted to, you could squash it or move it outside or whatever you wanted to do. You're big enough, you could do it. It's a little spider. But yet some people are just overwhelmingly terrified of spiders. They won't even go into the same room as a spider, even though they know that thing is over there and it's never going to touch me, that rationally they can't sort of get through that. So that's what I mean by irrational. It doesn't always make sense why the individual is afraid of that, but it happens. A lot of what we know about phobias is it's a learned experience. Individuals learn via classical conditioning. Maybe you only have to have one bad experience with a certain stimuli. Let's say if a dog bites you, maybe one time when you're a kid, that's all it really takes. And you might be afraid of dogs, and that's why. It is also inherited, or it's distributed via genetics, like most anxiety disorders. Some fears also are kind of it makes sense. They have an adaptive behavior, such as our fear of snakes, our fear of spiders, fear of heights, things like that, things that could potentially do us harm. That there is an adaptive sort of evolutionary explanation for that. And then again, these are things that we learn very quickly. It's not like we have to experience, getting bit by a spider or a dog or a snake more than once. We figure it out pretty quickly. We probably should avoid those things that would do us harm. And the idea is, when treating these disorders, the treatment evolves around unlearning. If you learn a certain phobia, we want to unlearn that phobia through principles of learning, classical and operant conditioning. So here are some examples of phobic disorders. I'm not going to go over all of these, but acrophobia, fear of heights, cynophobia, fear of dogs, hydrophobia, fear of water, xenophobia, fear of strangers. That's not a good one either. That a lot of times, ends up being associated with not just strangers, but people who are different from me, like people who are racially, ethnically different than me. So it's not just strangers. Social anxiety or social phobias, it's a very specific kind of phobia. It's an intense fear, usually of being humiliated or embarrassed in some sort of public situation. It's tied to genetics. It's tied to the way the brain is organized, our distribution of neurotransmitters like serotonin and oxytocin. Psychologically, it's associated with certain parenting styles, different social experiences, those that are rewarded and punished, different attentional biases. Maybe, if you were biased to kind of look for negative information where people might be saying something about you, maybe that's all you focus on and you're ignoring all this other stuff. So it's not just one factor, it's a number of factors. Obsessive compulsive disorder, even though it's not under the same umbrella anymore, it is still related to the anxiety disorders. This is where an individual has persistent anxiety, stress invoking thoughts that they are compelled to engage in ritualistic behaviors to prevent those thoughts. The obsessions are the thoughts, the compulsions are the behaviors used to rid the thoughts. So an obsession is a recurring thought, the compulsion is the recurrent behavior. So an individual might have an obsession about safety. So their compulsion is to unlock their front door dozens or maybe hundreds of times before they feel safe. It's tied to biological factors, genetics, perhaps overactive regions of the brain, basal ganglia, frontal cortex, A lot of the same culprits we talked about: low serotonin, low dopamine, low glutamate in terms of neurotransmitters, and also might be associated with immune and digestive functioning dysfunction in those areas. The psychological factors involved, I mean, stress is really kind of the key to all this stuff. The more stress you have in your life, the more pronounced some of these things are going to be, or potentially could be. And also that difficulty filtering out negative thoughts, being able to pick out and understand, okay, that's just a thought. It's not true. Just because a thought goes in my head doesn't make it true. And being able to filter out those negative thoughts versus positive ones. So, the diagnosis, is this related disorder? Sorry. Other related disorders: hoarding, obsessively hoarding certain objects, excoriation, skin picking, also trichomania. Mania is hair pulling, body dysmorphic disorder, having an obsession about a perceived flaw in one's body and attempting to change that flaw. Also, a disorder that used to be under the umbrella of anxiety, but now it's kind of its own thing, is PTSD, otherwise known as post-traumatic stress disorder. This can happen to exposure to any traumatic event. It does not have to be combat. It can be abuse. It can be a natural disaster or unnatural disaster. And you don't have to just be a combat veteran to experience it. Any traumatic event can potentially lead to the development of this disorder. So a lot of times the symptoms may happen immediately, or some take time to emerge. Those might be flashbacks, dreams of the traumatic event, avoiding certain emotional experiences that might remind you of the traumatic event, or simply just being emotionally numb, engaging in more impulsive behavior. So, substance abuse, for example, being startled easily, having inability or difficulty concentrating and remembering things. And the big, in terms of etiology, it's history of trauma. The more exposure you have to trauma, the more likely it is that this disorder will develop. Also, cultural background, and in a sense of how do we process trauma? Different cultures might process trauma in a different way. Also, genetic predisposition. Some individuals may have a greater disposition based on their biology and whether or not they will, develop PTSD. Dissociative disorders, these are their own class as well. These are a sudden loss of memory or change in identity. To dissociate, typically what we're talking about is individuals who are dealing with extreme stress, and a lot of times it's in response to trauma, maybe traumatic experiences, maybe some from childhood, maybe not, but what we're talking about really is integrating emotional memories that are tied to the stress, that are tied to that specific trauma. So the different types: there's dissociative amnesia, where an individual will have extreme memory loss, especially about their personal information. Again, this is a response to trauma. This is a response to stress. There's also DID, dissociative identity disorder, where the individual has two or more distinct personalities or identities residing within the same body. So one individual, specifically looking at DID, one individual has two or more distinct personalities. These different personalities have distinct memories, behaviors, relationships, maybe even genders, ages. Typically, only one personality is dominant at a time. The idea behind this is that the altered personalities are there to sort of protect and insulate the original, the original personality. This is, again, kind of like PTSD. It's trauma, it's abuse. This is the most common thread we see with DID is severe exposure to trauma and abuse in early childhood. It also, like many things biopsychosocial, there is a component of genetics involved. And there is some debate, there is some idea behind whether or not this is spread through social contagion. For example, there was a period of time where this disorder wasn't very diagnosed much at all, and all of a sudden a movie came out, Sybil. I think this is what this is depicting here. I might be incorrect, but the movie Sybil, about a woman with multiple personalities, afterwards more diagnoses began to happen. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that people watched the movie and it caused them to, develop a disorder, but maybe it could have been people who were living it with all their life, didn't know, didn't think anything of it until they saw the movie. So who knows? I mean, it's somewhat of a debate, but it's one that psychologists have and to some extent still continue to debate about. Now we're moving into mood disorders, where we're talking about dysfunctional moods. Our moods alter, they fluctuate throughout the day. It's okay to be sad. It's okay to be really excited about things, but we're talking about mood disorders. We're talking about extremes in sadness, extremes in happiness. So a mood disorder is when an individual is suffering from depression, typical, or maybe we're talking about mania. We're talking about absence of joy, low energy, high levels of sadness. It is becoming more common, and it's also, it kind of goes in hand with other chronic physical illnesses. A lot of times it's kind of one of those chicken or egg things. Did the depression lead to chronic physical illness, or is it, vice versa? So typically when we say depression, we're talking about major depression, where an episode that's lasting for at least 2 weeks and daily functioning is impaired, meaning maybe they're not bathing themselves, going to work, going to school, whatever. Symptoms might be loss of interest, fatigue, sense of worthlessness, disturbance in sleep and appetite, inability to concentrate, to think, and also maybe engaging in suicidal ideation. Where does this come from? There's a strong component to genetics, and there's a lot of activity. Appears to be an underactivity of prefrontal cortex, regulation of neurotransmitters like norepinephrine, serotonin. Psychologically speaking, individuals can actually learn to become depressed through processes of learned helplessness. Of, like, if you experience like setback after setback after setback, or defeat after defeat, if you just keep getting knocked down in life, you kind of learn, oh, this is what happens to me. Nothing goes right. And that can be in a way can be reinforced. Having ruminating thoughts, self-defeating thoughts, being more pessimistic, those are also associated with depression. Socioculturally, people who are more poor, people who belong to low socioeconomic status are more likely to be diagnosed with depression. There's also gender differences, meaning we see, it's more common for females to be diagnosed than males. We do see also differences across different cultures. For example, for the most part, we do see, women tend to be more diagnosed than men, but different countries have different exposures to diagnoses of depression. For example, Beirut, Lebanon. these are all fairly, developed cities, countries, but it's quite high. It looks like it's like almost 4 times as high as the United States, or I guess 3 times as high. Sorry, I was looking at Puerto Rico, but different cultures will experience this in different ways. Bipolar disorder is the other, commonly diagnosed, discussed mood disorder. And instead of thinking about, depression, now we're talking about fluctuating from extremes of mania, that extreme happiness, and then down to depression. And we're talking about going through episodes, cycling through episodes, mania, depression. Usually these cycles are separated by 6 months to a year. Rapid cycling isn't as common as maybe you might see in like movies and TV shows and things like that. There is a strong genetic component, meaning if your biological mother, biological father has bipolar disorder, a much greater likelihood that you will as well. And we're talking about, swings in metabolic activity in terms of the cerebral cortex, these, high highs, low lows, and the levels of neurotransmitters, serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, things like that are going to be varying and fluctuating. So here's what I mean by the genetic influence. Like, the closer you are in genetic relationship to somebody with bipolar disorder, the likelihood of you developing as well, it becomes higher. So the general population looks like maybe like 2%. If you have a fraternal twin with bipolar, then it's probably looking around like 11-12% maybe. And then if you're talking about an identical twin who has the same exact genetic material, we're talking about a 70% chance or greater. So sharing the same genetic material, huge influence on the development and expression of this disorder. So in terms of what the brain looks like when somebody is going through mania and through depression, the top and bottom, this is somebody who is in a manic state. This does say they're a rapid cycler, so it looks like they're happening pretty frequently. They're going from mania depression, looks like within 10 days rather than months, which is not quite as common as you might expect. Versus look at the middle. This is the brain during a manic state, very active. The color changes. It's just the activity is so much more is happening. Eating disorders, again, this is where we're talking about, having a relationship with food that is dysfunctional to health, dysfunctional for a lot of things. One of the more commonly diagnosed eating disorders is anorexia nervosa. This is where an individual has a misperception about their own body weight. Even though they know they're underweight, they might literally or figuratively see themselves as being, weighing more, and attempt to become thinner, maybe through starvation, for example. And this is, so it's a distorted body image, intense fear of gaining weight, and actually can kill. In terms of mortality rate, in terms of psychological disorders, this is one that can in fact kill people. You can become so malnourished, you can become so, your body's lacking the things it needs to survive, that you can in fact die. And so like somebody with anorexia nervosa, you might actually physically be able to tell, versus bulimia nervosa may not be so obvious. The individual may engage in binge eating, eating patterns, like eating a lot of food and then purging it away, whether through exercise, laxatives, or making themselves vomit. They'll have an obsession with food, but also an intense fear of becoming overweight. Binge eating disorder is like bulimia, but it is without the purging aspect. It's obsessions with the food, eating a lot of food, but not trying to purge it. All of these disorders are associated with, genetics, neurotransmissions, the impact of the disorders, comorbidity with other disorders like anxiety, like depression, and also social and biological factors. I mean, think about, in the United States, we have a very, our culture is sort of, for better or worse at times, mostly worse, is built around this idea of like thinness. Like thin is the ideal sort of state of body that we project in our culture. So, think about the kind of messages that sends to people, children, adolescents, adults, what that sends, and people might do all kinds of things to try to, to fit those certain standards, whether they're healthy or not. In terms of, debility, whether or not a disorder, how debilitating it is, I think schizophrenia is perhaps the most debilitating disorder we're going to talk about. It is a very severe disorder related to disorganized thinking. It's the first disorder I think we've talked about that's going to be associated with psychosis, meaning being out of touch with reality. Your thoughts and your perceptions, the way you see the world, is just removed from what is actually happening. This disorder is typically diagnosed in early adulthood, so like your 20s. It is in terms of suicide risk, it is one of the highest suicide risks. And in order to treat this disorder, it requires very powerful medications, antipsychotic medications intended to treat both the positive and negative symptoms. And what I mean by positive, I don't mean good. I don't mean, good or bad. I mean, positive means there's something extra there that somebody with schizophrenia has that somebody without schizophrenia doesn't. So that includes hallucinations, hearing things that aren't there, like voices, delusions, having false beliefs, like delusions of grandeur, thinking that you're extremely important, and when it turns out you're not, you're just some normal person, I should say. Referential thinking, disorders of movement, being catatonic. Those negative symptoms are the absence of something we would quote unquote say normal. So that might be social withdrawal, flat affect in terms of emotions, like no emotional expression. Cognitive symptoms might be in difficulty, basically anything involving cognition, keeping your attention, memorizing, reflecting, things like that, interpreting information, making decisions. And this, again, like bipolar disorder, is strongly tied to genetics. Again, the closer you are in relation to somebody with schizophrenia in terms of your genetics, the greater your likelihood. So identical twins, if an identical twin has schizophrenia, the likelihood that the other twin has it is basically a coin flip. So also associated with structural brain abnormalities, regulation of neurotransmitters like dopamine. Psychological factors, the more exposed people are to stress, especially if they already have the genetic predisposition, it increases their likelihood. Sociocultural factors, poverty, for example, definitely will have a strong influence on how the disorder might progress. people who live in developed, non-industrialized nations, research shows, tend to have better outcomes. It seems like those societies just have figured out a more maybe compassionate, humane way to treat people who are dealing with schizophrenia. So again, I mentioned this on a previous slide. I mean, identical twins, basically a coin flip. If one has schizophrenia, the likelihood the other has it is like a coin flip. Personality disorders, this is when we talk about, personality as our typical response to the world, how we think, how we behave, so personality disorders are when those typical responses become maladaptive, when they disrupt basic life functioning. So one of those is antisocial personality disorder. In the criminal justice system, you might call somebody with this a psychopath or sociopath. These individuals, are typically engaging in antisocial behavior, law breaking, violence, deceit, scamming people, and they have no regret. They don't care that they're hurting people, whether it's physically, emotionally, financially. They tend to be more impulsive, irritable, reckless, irresponsible. It is associated with biology, associated with childhood abuse and gender differences. Men are more likely to be diagnosed than women. Borderline personality is kind of the reverse. More women are more likely to be diagnosed than men. It's associated with instability in relationships, emotions, self-image, engaging in impulsive behavior. Some of the essential, kind of features, the nitty gritty, unstable emotions, unstable sense of self, negative interpersonal relationships with other people, and they might engaging in self-harm. Maybe that's, cutting, destructive physical behaviors. It's associated with genetics, also with childhood abuse, and there might be some cognitive components in terms of irrational belief about being unacceptable or powerless, things like that. All of these disorders we've talked about, I mean, some are more associated with suicidal ideation and others, depression, schizophrenia, things like that. But it's important if we're talking about mental illness, it's important, to talk about, the risk of suicide. About 90% of people who die by suicide are estimated to have a psychological disorder, meaning they're most likely, that's 9 out of 10 people, who commit suicide. There are gender differences. Women are more likely to attempt suicide. However, men are more likely to actually commit and actually die by suicide. And a lot of that has to do with the methods. Men are more likely to use kind of extreme, methods that are pretty much guaranteed to lead to suicide. Like if you use a gun on yourself versus trying to take medications and overdosing. One is almost guaranteed. The other, there's a lot of other factors involved. So there's genetics as well, low levels of serotonin, poor physical health, especially if you're talking about individuals living with chronic disease. The psychological factors, psychological disorders do increase the likelihood, traumatic experiences, if you add that in as well, exposure to stress, substance abuse, being victimized by bullies, and those are all potential contributors. Thomas Joyner has sort of this interpersonal theory of suicide that you'll read about. It's sort of built on this, okay, there's a desire to die, and you need to also have an acquired capacity for suicide, actually have the means of being able to do it. What are some other factors? Chronic economic hardship, being exposed to poverty, not having a lot of, opportunities financially. We do see its lowest in rates with stronger cultural and religious norms that are against suicide. So for example, like cultures like built around Catholicism, for example, where that is very much frowned upon culturally and religiously, you're probably going to see a lot lower rates of suicide compared to others. Cultures built around the culture of honor, when people feel like their honor has been besmirched in such an extreme way that suicide seems like the only choice. And that's maybe not necessarily, maybe not associated as strongly in the United States, but think about in Japanese culture, I don't know how common it is nowadays, but that idea, if you get shamed, bring shame to your family to the point where you've dishonored yourself and dishonored them. I think historically suicide has been one of those, potential options. So that kind of culture of honor in extreme cases can be associated with suicide. What should you do if somebody is threatening suicide? Don't be afraid to ask direct, straightforward questions about what their experience. Be calm about it. Be supportive. Listen. Talk about, that this is maybe unbearable, but it isn't permanent. It's something that can be survived. take the threat very seriously. If it really does seem like, oh my gosh, they're about to, they're going to do this, like for real, they're not joking about it. You need to stay with that person until some sort of help arrives. I believe now there's a 988 number you can contact and get actual help for mental health crises like this, and encourage this person to get help and be the person to help them get help. Don't just hey, here's the number. It's like, no, I'm gonna put the number in your phone and I'm gonna call it for you the first time and hand you the phone and we're gonna be on speaker, or whatever you got to do. Things you should not do. Don't ignore it. It's okay to talk about it. Refusing to talk about it's not the way to go. Don't react negatively, horror, disapproval, shame, things like that. Don't offer false assurances that everything we're going to be okay. Don't abandon them. Until it's, so this is actually an old slide. This number, I believe, is out of date. It's just 988, excuse me. You can put it now into your phone. If you or somebody else, is experiencing suicidal ideation or attempting suicide, I mean, there are resources for you. And again, I can't say this enough. It is suicide is a permanent solution to an impermanent problem. Even the worst of our worst emotions and experiences, they will come to an end at some point. Which I know it sucks. It's not like doesn't make it any better in the moment, but it's just something that's important to keep in mind. So what do we do? Last thing in terms of combating the stigma about mental illness. One, we need to be more aware that it's more common. Being psychological disorders are much more common than maybe we think. And the label of those disorders, we need to understand they do carry weight. They can be sticky. They can stick to people. Like being, diagnosed with a disorder can lead to prejudice, can lead to discrimination. There is a misunderstanding that people who are mentally ill are more likely to be violent. In fact, people who are mentally ill are more likely to be the victim of violence, not the other way around. So we need to be mindful of those kinds of correlations. Stigma could be also seen as a barrier to treatment. People who are afraid to come forward and admit they have a problem are less likely to get help for that problem. So the idea is, we want to resist thinking of people as disorders as being defined by their condition. They are more than just their condition and their diagnoses. We want to empower those individuals to see that they're not alone and there are people out there like them, living their lives successfully with disorders. And I think it'll go a long way to overcoming the stigma. So that's going to do it for chapter 12. We'll pick back up on chapter 13. So let me know if you have any questions in the comment box or on Canvas. So otherwise, I'll see you around. Take care. Bye.